George Harrison was the Beatles' lead guitarist, but there were important moments when the band recorded without him. Sometimes George simply wasn't needed for the arrangement. Other times, Paul McCartney or John Lennon had a very specific musical idea that could be completed with fewer players. The result is a fascinating collection of Beatles recordings where one of the band's 4 members is completely absent from the master. These songs prove that the Beatles' sound didn't always depend on all 4 musicians being in the room. And in some cases, the absence of George Harrison allowed Paul McCartney, John Lennon, and Ringo Starr to create recordings that were remarkably different from the band's usual 4-piece sound. Number 5. For No One, 1966.
Your day breaks, your mind aches, you find that
For No One is one of the quietest and most emotionally devastating songs on Revolver, and George Harrison isn't on the recording at all. Written primarily by Paul McCartney, the song describes the painful realization that a relationship is ending. But musically, Paul deliberately kept the arrangement extremely restrained. He played the piano and clavichord while also providing the lead vocal. Ringo Starr supplied the drums and percussion. That was essentially the Beatles' lineup for the track. There was no George Harrison, there was no John Lennon.
a love that should have lasted years.
Instead, producer George Martin brought in Alan Civil, one of Britain's leading French horn players, to perform the song's distinctive horn solo. The decision was unusual. The Beatles were famous for their 4-piece identity, yet one of their most elegant compositions from 1966 was built around just 2 Beatles and an outside musician. Civil's French horn became the emotional centerpiece of the arrangement, adding a melancholy classical color that would have been difficult to achieve with a conventional rock instrumentation. Paul's clavichord and restrained piano created the delicate foundation, while Ringo's understated percussion kept the song moving without disturbing its intimate atmosphere.
You stay home, she goes out, she said.
The result was unlike the louder, more experimental tracks surrounding it on Revolver. And that's what makes For No One so fascinating. George Harrison wasn't needed to make the song work. Neither was John Lennon. Paul had written the composition so specifically that he could construct almost the entire recording himself, with Ringo and Alan Civil providing exactly the additional textures required. For one of the Beatles' most heartbreaking songs, the quietest choice was also the most radical. Leave George Harrison and John Lennon out completely. Number 4. Julia, 1968.
What I say is meaningless.
Julia is one of the most intimate recordings in the Beatles' catalog, and George Harrison isn't on it. In fact, neither Paul McCartney nor Ringo Starr performed on the finished track either. As the closing song on the first side of the White Album, Julia stands apart from almost everything else on the record. John Lennon wrote it as a deeply personal song, drawing on memories of his mother, Julia Lennon, who had died when John was still a teenager. The song also carried another personal connection. Its imagery was influenced by John's relationship with Yoko Ono. But unlike most Beatles recordings, John didn't need the band to tell this story. He recorded the entire performance himself.
Seashell eyes.
John sang the lead vocal while accompanying himself on acoustic guitar, using a delicate finger-picking technique influenced by Donovan, who had shown him and other Beatles some guitar techniques during their 1968 stay in India. The arrangement was intentionally stripped down. No drums, no bass, no electric guitar, no piano, and most importantly, no George Harrison. There was no attempt to turn Julia into a conventional Beatles production. Instead, the recording was allowed to remain vulnerable and exposed, with John's voice sitting directly against the acoustic guitar. That simplicity makes the absence of George even more significant.
Julia.
George was the Beatles' lead guitarist, yet this song didn't require a lead guitar at all. John had created an arrangement where adding another musician might have weakened the emotional intimacy. The result became one of the most personal performances John ever recorded for the Beatles. It sounds less like a band recording and more like John sitting alone with his guitar, singing directly about memories he had carried for years. Julia proved that sometimes the most powerful Beatles recording was the one where there was barely a Beatles band at all. Number 3. Blackbird, 1968.
In the dead of night.
One of the Beatles' most beloved acoustic recordings was created almost entirely by Paul McCartney alone, and George Harrison never played a note on it. Recorded during the White Album sessions, Blackbird was deliberately kept simple. Paul performed the lead vocal and played the acoustic guitar himself. Underneath the performance was the unmistakable sound of his foot tapping against the floor, creating a subtle rhythmic pulse that helped give the recording its intimate character. There was no George Harrison adding lead guitar, no John Lennon contributing rhythm guitar, no Ringo Starr playing drums. It was essentially Paul McCartney alone in the studio. Even the sounds of birds heard in the background were added as an atmospheric touch, reinforcing the song's connection with nature. That simplicity was part of Paul's vision.
You were only waiting for this.
Rather than building the song into a full Beatles arrangement, he allowed the acoustic guitar and vocal to remain exposed. Every small detail could therefore be heard: the finger-picked guitar, Paul's breathing, the rhythm of his foot, and the delicate bird sounds. The result was remarkably different from the more experimental and heavily produced recordings surrounding it on the White Album. But Blackbird wasn't merely a stripped-down Beatles song. It demonstrated how much Paul had developed as a performer and arranger. He could create a complete recording without needing the other three Beatles to fill the space.
Into the light of a dark black night.
And George's absence is particularly interesting because he was the band's lead guitarist. There simply wasn't a role for him. Paul's guitar part already provided everything the song needed. The recording became one of the Beatles' most enduring acoustic performances and remains a perfect example of how a single Beatle could sometimes create something complete without the rest of the band. No George, no John, no Ringo. Just Paul, an acoustic guitar, a tapping foot, and the sound of birds. And somehow, it became one of the Beatles' most timeless recordings. Number 2. The Ballad of John and Yoko, 1969.
Standing in the dockets of Hampton.
One of the most unusual Beatles singles was recorded without George Harrison and without Ringo Starr. In fact, it was essentially John Lennon and Paul McCartney alone in the studio. In April 1969, John Lennon wanted to record The Ballad of John and Yoko as quickly as possible. The song documented the events surrounding John's marriage to Yoko Ono, including the intense media attention and the couple's highly publicized honeymoon and peace campaign. But there was a practical problem. Ringo Starr was away filming The Magic Christian. George Harrison was also unavailable, so John and Paul simply went ahead without them.
You know how hard it can be.
At Abbey Road, the two songwriting partners handled virtually the entire recording themselves. John played acoustic guitar and sang the lead vocal. Paul took on several instruments, including bass, drums, and piano, effectively becoming the rhythm section. There was no George Harrison providing lead guitar. There was no Ringo Starr behind the drum kit. Just John and Paul. And unlike some Beatles recordings that took weeks to develop, this one was completed remarkably quickly. The urgency actually suited the song. John's vocal is direct and energetic, while Paul's drumming gives the track a relentless forward momentum. The two musicians sound almost like a compact rock and roll duo, rather than the world's most famous four-piece band.
I said we're only trying to get us some peace, Christ.
The recording also reveals something fascinating about Lennon and McCartney's relationship. Despite all the tension surrounding the Beatles by 1969, when John needed a song recorded immediately, Paul was still the person he could call on. They walked into the studio, picked up their instruments, and got the job done. The result became a Beatles single despite featuring only two Beatles. George Harrison wasn't there, Ringo Starr wasn't there. But John Lennon and Paul McCartney proved that the chemistry that had built the Beatles could still ignite instantly when the two of them were working side by side. Number 1. Yesterday, 1965.
Yesterday.
Few Beatles songs demonstrate George Harrison's absence more clearly than Yesterday. Recorded during the Help sessions in 1965, the song was essentially a Paul McCartney solo performance. Unlike the band's usual recordings, there was no role for George Harrison's electric guitar, no Ringo Starr drum part, and no John Lennon contribution. Paul performed the song himself on acoustic guitar and lead vocal. Then George Martin suggested something that completely changed the character of the recording: a string quartet. The arrangement gave Paul exactly what the song needed, without turning it into a conventional Beatles rock performance. That was important because the composition was fundamentally different from the group's usual material. There was no driving rhythm section, no electric guitar riff, and no need for the four Beatles to play together.
Love was such an easy game to play.
Instead, the emotional weight came from Paul's melody and vocal, supported by the restrained classical arrangement. George Harrison therefore had no instrumental role on the recording, and neither did John or Ringo. The other Beatles had reportedly considered whether adding their usual instruments would actually improve the song. In the end, the decision was obvious. There simply wasn't a meaningful rock part for them to play. The finished recording became one of the most famous songs in popular music. Its simplicity was its strength. Paul didn't need three other Beatles filling the arrangement. He needed space around the melody.
Now I need a place to hide away.
George Martin's string quartet provided that space while keeping the performance intimate and focused. And that makes Yesterday one of the most extraordinary recordings in Beatles history. The song carried the Beatles' name, but musically it was almost entirely Paul McCartney. George Harrison didn't sit this one out because he couldn't contribute. He sat it out because the song had already said everything it needed to say.